kin selection is the evolutionary strategy that favors the reproductive success of an organism's relatives, even at a cost to the organism's own survival and reproduction. Kin altruism is altruistic behaviour whose evolution is driven by kin selection. Kin selection is an instance of inclusive fitness, which combines the number of offspring produced with the number an individual can produce by supporting others, such as siblings. Charles Darwin discussed the concept of kin selection in his 1859 book, The Origin of Species, where he reflected on the puzzle of sterile social insects, such as honeybees, which leave reproduction to their sisters, arguing that a selection benefit to related organisms would allow the evolution of a trait that confers the benefit but destroys an individual at the same time. R. A. Fisher in 1930 and J.B.S. Haldane in 1932 set out the mathematics of kin selection, with Haldane famously joking that he would willingly die for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. In 1964, W. D. Hamilton popularized the concept in the major advance in the mathematical treatment of the phenomenon by George R. Price, which has become known as Hamilton's rule. In the same year, John Maynard Smith used the actual term kin selection for the first time. According to Hamilton's rule, kin selection causes genes to increase in frequency when the genetic relatedness of a recipient to an actor multiplied by the benefit to the recipient is greater than the reproductive cost to the actor. The rule is difficult to test, but a study of red squirrels in 2010 found that adoption of orphans by surrogate mothers in the wild occurred only when the conditions of Hamilton's rule were met. Hamilton proposed 2 mechanisms for kin selection: kin recognition, where individuals are able to identify their relatives, and viscous populations, where dispersal is rare enough for populations to be closely related. The viscous population mechanism makes kin selection and social cooperation possible in the absence of kin recognition. Nurture kinship, the treatment of individuals as kin when they live together, is sufficient for kin selection, given reasonable assumptions about dispersal rates. Kin selection is not the same thing as group selection, where natural selection acts on the group as a whole. In humans, altruism is more likely and on a larger scale with kin than with unrelated individuals. For example, humans give presents according to how closely related they are to the recipient. In other species, vervet monkeys use allomothering, where related females such as older sisters or grandmothers often care for young, according to their relatedness. The social shrimp Synelphius regalis protects juveniles within highly related colonies. Historical overview: Charles Darwin was the first to discuss the concept of kin selection. In The Origin of Species, he wrote clearly about the conundrum represented by altruistic sterile social insects that this difficulty, though appearing insuperable, is lessened, or, as I believe, disappears, when it is remembered that selection may be applied to the family, as well as to the individual, and may thus gain the desired end. Breeders of cattle wish the flesh and fat to be well marbled together. An animal thus characterized has been slaughtered, but the breeder has gone with confidence to the same stock and has succeeded. In this passage the family and stock stand for a kin group. These passages and others by Darwin about kin selection are highlighted in D.J. Futuma's textbook of reference Evolutionary Biology and in E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology. The earliest mathematically formal treatments of kin selection were by R. A. Fisher in 1930 and J.B.S. Haldane in 1932 and 1955. J.B.S. Haldane fully grasped the basic quantities and considerations in kin selection, famously writing, "I would lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins." Haldane's remark alluded to the fact that if an individual loses its life to save 2 siblings, 4 nephews, or 8 cousins, it is a fair deal in evolutionary terms, as siblings are on average 50% identical by descent, nephews 25%, and cousins 12.5%. But Haldane also joked that he would truly die only to save more than a single identical twin of his or more than 2 full siblings. In 1955 he clarified, "Let us suppose that you carry a rare gene that affects your behavior so that you jump into a flooded river and save a child, but you have 1 chance in 10 of being drowned, while I do not possess the gene, and stand on the bank and watch the child drown. If the child's your own child or your brother or sister, there is an even chance that this child will also have this gene, so 5 genes will be saved in children for 1 lost in an adult. If you save a grandchild or a nephew, the advantage is only 2.5 to 1. If you only save a first cousin, the effect is very slight. If you try to save your first cousin once removed, the population is more likely to lose this valuable gene than to gain it. It is clear that genes making for conduct of this kind would only have a chance of spreading in rather small populations when most of the children were fairly near relatives of the man who risked his life. W. D. Hamilton, in 1963 and especially in 1964, popularized the concept in the more thorough mathematical treatment given to it by George Price. John Maynard Smith may have coined the actual term kin selection in 1964. These processes I will call kin selection and group selection respectively. Kin selection has been discussed by Haldane and by Hamilton. By kin selection I mean the evolution of characteristics which favor the survival of close relatives of the affected individual, by processes which do not require any discontinuities in the population breeding structure. Kin selection causes changes in gene frequency across generations, driven by interactions between related individuals. This dynamic forms the conceptual basis of the theory of social evolution. Some cases of evolution by natural selection can only be understood by considering how biological relatives influence each other's fitness. Under natural selection, a gene encoding a trait that enhances the fitness of each individual carrying it should increase in frequency within the population. And conversely, a gene that lowers the individual fitness of its carriers should be eliminated. However, a hypothetical gene that prompts behavior which enhances the fitness of relatives but lowers that of the individual displaying the behavior, may nonetheless increase in frequency, because relatives often carry the same gene. According to this principle, the enhanced fitness of relatives can at times more than compensate for the fitness loss incurred by the individuals displaying the behavior, making kin selection possible. This is a special case of a more general model, inclusive fitness. This analysis has been challenged, Wilson writing that the foundations of the general theory of inclusive fitness based on the theory of kin selection have crumbled, and that he now relies instead on the theory of eusociality and gene culture coevolution for the underlying mechanics of sociobiology. Kin selection should not be confused with group selection, according to which a genetic trait can become prevalent within a group because it benefits the group as a whole, regardless of any benefit to individual organisms. All known forms of group selection conform to the principle that an individual behavior can be evolutionarily successful only if the genes responsible for this behavior conform to Hamilton's rule, and hence, on balance and in the aggregate, benefit from the behavior. Hamilton's rule, formally, genes should increase in frequency when where R equals the genetic relatedness of the recipient to the actor, often defined as the probability that a gene picked randomly from each at the same locus is identical by descent. B equals the additional reproductive benefit gained by the recipient of the altruistic act, C equals the reproductive cost to the individual performing the act. This inequality is known as Hamilton's rule after W. D. Hamilton, who in 1964 published the first formal quantitative treatment of kin selection. The relatedness parameter in Hamilton's rule was introduced in 1922 by Swarwright as a coefficient of relationship that gives the probability that at a random locus, the alleles there will be identical by descent. Subsequent authors, including Hamilton, sometimes reformulate this with a regression, which, unlike probabilities, can be negative. A regression analysis producing statistically significant negative relationships indicates that two individuals are less genetically alike than two random ones. This has been invoked to explain the evolution of spiteful behavior consisting of acts that result in harm, or loss of fitness, to both the actor and the recipient. There has been little empirical support for Hamilton's rule in wild animals, as it is hard to quantify the costs and benefits of different behaviors. The first study to test Hamilton's rule successfully was in 2010, involving a wild population of red squirrels in Yukon, Canada. The researchers found that surrogate mothers would adopt related orphan squirrel pups but not unrelated orphans. The researchers calculated the cost of adoption by measuring a decrease in the survival probability of the entire litter after increasing the litter by one pup. while benefit was measured as the increased chance of survival of the orphan. The degree of relatedness of the orphan and surrogate mother for adoption to occur depended on the number of pups the surrogate mother already had in her nest, as this affected the cost of adoption. The study showed that females always adopted orphans when a BC, but never adopted when a B.